Hello friends, welcome to this session of our course on the Introduction to the Quran. Today is a special session because we have a guest who will be discussing with us the question of one particular aspect of the Quran which has interesting intersections with the biblical tradition, namely the question of Adam and the devil in the Quran. Our guest today is Professor Gary Anderson, who's a professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament here at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Theology. Professor Anderson is known for his work not only on the Bible itself and the text of the Bible, but also on the reception of the Bible among Jews and Christians in the first centuries of the Common Era or the Christian era. And he works on the way Jews and Christians have read the Bible and developed strategies and methods and themes in that reading of the Bible. Among his publications is a book specifically dedicated to the question of Adam and Eve in the biblical tradition. It's entitled The Genesis of Perfection, was published in 2001 with the subtitle Adam and Eve in Jewish and Christian Imagination. In 2009, he published a book with an exciting title, a alluring title, which is Sin, a History, which traces the concept of sin in Jewish and Christian thought. And more recently, in 2013, he published Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition. Professor Anderson, welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. So I thought we'd discuss today together some elements of the Quran which involve Adam and Eve. Now, Eve is never mentioned by name, but she's there implicitly in the Quranic text. And also the whole scenario of the fall of the devil first, and then what transpires then with the devil and Adam and Eve in the garden, in the heavenly garden. And we'll speak a bit about where the garden is exactly, in addition to the details that surround these three characters. Why don't we start with a very well-known verse of the Quran, which is Quran chapter 2, verse 30. In this verse, the Quran has God make an announcement to the angels that he's going to create man. And he uses a very interesting word for the creation of man. In Arabic, it's khalifa. In the translation we're using in this course, which is done by Talal Itani, Itani uses the word successor. So his text reads, "When your Lord said to the angels, I am placing a successor on earth." Again, the Arabic word is khalifa. That can have another meaning. As you know, the meaning of khalifa could also be something like vice-regent or representative. So when your Lord said this to the angels then reply, "Will you place in it someone who will cause corruption in it and shed blood?" They seem to know this. They seem to know that this creation is going to cause trouble. "While we, that is we the angels, declare your praises and sanctify you." He said, that is God said, "I know what you do not know." So this word, I think, is where I'd like to begin, this word khalifa. Muslim commentators are divided over exactly how to understand it. Is it successor? Is God creating a successor? Is he created a representative? And what could that mean? Or something like a vice-regent? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts generally and see some connections maybe with Jewish and Christian interpretations of Genesis.
So this is a very interesting text, and I think it represents a theme that one can find in a variety of early Jewish and Christian documents. And that has to do with the theme of the exaltation of Adam, which the angels, at least initially, or some of them at least, are worried about, or the evaluation of Adam and Eve as moral agents, what we might say is the classical issue of theodicy. That is, why would God create individuals who can wreak havoc on earth? Right. So we have these two questions, I think, that are at issue here. But let's just begin with the notion of the exaltation of Adam, which I think the one translation you give for Khalifa suits quite well. That is, Adam as vice-regent. We don't necessarily get this idea clearly in Genesis 2 and 3, but there is another text in the book of Psalms which does allude to something like this. Here I'm thinking of a very famous psalm, at least as it's cited also in the New Testament, Psalm 8, that has this very interesting line about creation. So early Jewish readers thought this referred to Adam and his heirs. It says, Tamshilehu b'ma'aseh yadecha, which we would translate, you shall appoint him as king over the works of your hand. And then interesting, the next line says, kol, that is everything, shata tachat raglav, everything you've put underneath his feet. Now how this gets used in the epistle to Hebrews is very interesting because it's applied to Christ. But if we think of it with respect to Adam, what does it mean when God says, I'm going to put everything under your feet? In certain texts, this was understood, that is certain early Jewish texts, as a line addressed to the angels. And so the angels' immediate worry is that they were going to be subject then to the whims and wishes of this man, yes.
Right. Okay. And one of the problems that Muslim theologians have with this text is this notion that what exactly is the status of humanity? We have in the biblical tradition the notion of humanity as, or man being created in the image of God. This text doesn't say that explicitly, but it does sort of suggest that man has a certain role which gives him a certain dignity, even above the angels.
Right.
It also makes the angels, as you sort of suggest there, something we find already in the Bible, object to that, sort of oppose God's will. Something else that's interesting is that they seem to know that this man is going to cause trouble. So they know he's going to, as the text says, cause corruption and shed blood. Is there anything we find in the biblical tradition to that effect? Maybe there's not, but why do the angels have this knowledge about them? And then knowledge is a theme in the verse later when it says, God says, I know what you know not.
Yes, well, the knowledge is one theme. I guess I would like to put maybe my focus on a slightly different question, is why are they so worried about the moral stature or status of man in this passage? And I think this goes back to a very deep rabbinic tradition which has the angels representing in Hebrew the midat hadin, that is, the principle of justice. Whereas God represents the midat harachamim, a word that of course has a very good Arabic parallel, that is the measure of mercy. And so what happens in many of these stories is that we get a debate between God and the angels, because the angels are very, very concerned that justice be done. But God has this interest in the human project that goes beyond justice. He knows human beings are invested with free will and are going to choose to do things that the angels justly are not going to like. But God has an affection.
Which the angels don't do themselves. They say in the Quranic text, but we're always praising you. Something's wrong here.
But I think that's the thing that distinguishes human beings, is this element of free will. And so God has a special affection for human virtue because it comes out of a free choice. Whereas with the angels, it's something that, is simply kind of hardwired into their system. So God is willing to put up with, according to Jewish tradition, the errors that humans will make along the way, because he so deeply treasures the virtue that they can display when they display it. The angels can't understand this because they, at least according to these Jewish traditions, represent simply justice. They're the kind of stern figures who want every sin punished. But God is like the doting uncle, we might want to say, that looks beyond the errors the human beings make, because he has this deep affection for human beings that the angels simply can't comprehend.
Right. Okay. Right. So, the Quranic text doesn't stop there, this episode in which there's this back and forth between God and the angels, because we have in a separate section of the Quran, and the Quran is divided into these sections we call surahs. We just read this verse from Surah 2, and we'll now move to another surah, Surah 7, in which we seem to have a continuation of this episode, the same episode, because Surah 2:30, we have the creation of man and the angelic opposition to that creation. And then in Quran 7, we also find it in different places. Actually, I think it's in 7 different surahs. We find it, a particular incident in which God commands that the angels bow down to man, bow down to Adam, his new creation. So I'll just read these 2 verses and then I'll ask you for your thoughts about them. Quran chapter 7, verse 11, God says, we created you, then shaped you. So this is God in the Quran, the divine voice speaking to humanity. We created you, then shaped you. Then we said to the angels, bow down before Adam. So they bowed down. And then the Quranic text says, there seems to be one figure that doesn't bow down, except for Satan. He was not of those who bowed down. The text continues. I'll just read one more verse, because in fact, Satan gives a reason why he doesn't bow down before Adam. He said, that is God said, what prevented you from bowing down when I have commanded you? He said, that is, the devil responded, I am better than he. You created me from fire. You created him from mud. So just one more thing to preface maybe your remarks about this, which is this text is troubling to many Muslim commentators because it seems to show God commanding something almost in opposition to Muslim theological doctrine, right? Only God should be worshipped. And in fact, the word that's used for the angels to bow down to Adam in Arabic is related to sajada, which is the same action that a Muslim does in prayer, bowing down before God. Indeed, the word for mosque is masjid, which is a place of sajada. It's the place where you worship God, you bow down to God. But here God says to the angels, bow down before someone else, before Adam. So Muslim commentators have all sorts of debates and disputes about this. What insight can we gain about it looking at the biblical tradition?
So this is very interesting. The story itself, of course, doesn't appear in the Bible, but it's a story that's incredibly popular in early Jewish and Christian writings. Almost, maybe we might want to say, from the very beginning of biblical interpretation, this tradition is so old. It's not hard to see why a tradition like this would come to emerge within Judaism and Christianity, because the Bible doesn't itself describe to us why it is that the snake in Genesis 3 has it out for Adam and Eve. So early interpreters wanted to figure this out. How do we explain this? So we have this story of this, I call it a prostration scene in heaven, where, as you mentioned, and I think it is a shocking story, the angels are commanded to bow down before Adam and Eve. Now, Christian interpreters really liked this story because though it probably was of Jewish origin, they liked the story because they saw it as a premonition of what would be appropriate for the second Adam, that is Christ. And this very story appears in Milton's Paradise Lost, and many Milton scholars argue that it's precisely these early Jewish and Christian traditions that provide the background for the story Milton tells about the fall of Satan, which is very much like this. All the angels are gathered together, and they're asked to bow down before God's Christ.
So Milton could have gotten this most likely from Jewish and Christian sources, but maybe not the Quran.
That's right. Now, what we do have in the early Christian and Jewish sources is a slightly different reason for why Satan is going to refuse to bow down. We actually have two reasons, I should say. One that we do find here in the Quran, that Satan rejects this command because man is made from dust and he's made from fire, right? So he's a superior entity by virtue of how he is constituted. In a very famous text, the Cave of Treasures, written in Syriac, we have witness to this tradition in pre-Muslim material. But the more popular explanation that Satan is going to give for why he will not revere Adam is that of birth order. In other words, Satan is going to say, I was created first.
Right.
Adam was created after me. So it's an issue of primogeniture. And this is very interesting because this is grounded, and this is the reason why I think at base it's very much a Jewish idea, in the notion of the chosen people and the stories we find in Genesis in which latter-born sons usurp the role of the firstborn son.
Right.
And in every one of these stories, of course, it's the occasion for great animosity among the siblings. Jacob and Esau,
right.
Cain and Abel, Joseph and his brothers.
Okay.
And even, I would say, we could go into the New Testament and see the tensions, at least implied, between John the Baptist and Jesus on this ground. That's the reason why I think it's so important in John's Gospel that John say from the get-go that even though I was here first, I concede to you, that is Jesus, authority. He is, in a sense, I think, reflecting the issues we see in this type of
Because John the
tradition.
Baptist is born before Jesus.
Right, and he's preaching the kingdom of God before Jesus. So
Okay.
New Testament scholars, I think with good reason, have suggested that there probably were tensions between the Jesus and the John the Baptist camp. In other words, what's this, Johnny-come-lately doing, trying to steal, our
Right.
show, right?
Right.
We preach the kingdom of God, he's preaching the kingdom of God.
Right.
We baptize, he baptizes.
started first.
We started first,
And
right.
here in the Quranic text, there's something similar, but of course, it's the devil. Well, at least in the Jewish and Christian traditions that precede the Quranic text, the devil says, but I was created first. And
Exactly. Exactly. So these stories are, as I mentioned, found all over the Christian world, from classical Armenia, Georgia, all the way over to the Latin West, even into Ireland. I mean, these are hugely important and widely distributed stories, and the fact that they appear in the Quran, and as you mentioned, multiple times, is not a surprise, because everybody in the late antique world knew this story.
And it could be a testament to the importance of the story that it's found in the Quran at all. Because as we said, it seems to run contrary to the principal theological impulse of the Quran, which is only worship God, God alone. There's nothing like Him. God is above all things. And yet, nevertheless, we find this story.
If I could just add maybe one more point to that, just to finish up. I think there was, within the evolution of Christian theological thinking on this, similar worries, but they were able to solve the problem by taking these stories and applying them to the second Adam rather than the first Adam. I think that's what's so significant about Milton and Paradise Lost, is this is exactly, the type of behavior that would be absolutely appropriate for showing towards God, right? So when we locate these stories within the framework of the second Adam, then all of these theological troubles disappear.
But of course, the Quran, in a sense, the theological troubles reappear, because if for the Christians, the bowing down before Adam is an anticipation of the angelic worship of Christ, in the Quran, the divinity of Christ is clearly denied, and so Muslim theologians have to come up with other explanations for this text.
Right. We might want to say there then that what Muhammad does is he hears this story. For some reason he likes it, or certainly is deferential to its significance within late antique the Arabian Christians and Jews, but doesn't realize what he's handing on. And Islamic scholars have to somehow, make sense of a story that doesn't fit, as you put it, within the framework of more broader Islamic thought.
Right. Okay, well, the remarkable thing about this episode is that it continues. It begins with this question of the bowing down before Adam, and then it continues with something like a conversation between God and the devil. So the devil's in trouble, right? He's just denied God's command. Mm-hmm. Even though, amazingly, some Muslim mystics actually concluded that the devil made the right decision by not bowing down before God. The devil was the true monotheist, for not bowing down before Adam, the devil was the true monotheist. Nevertheless, he's in trouble in the Quranic text. And God says to him in verse 13, so the following verse, to the devil, "Get down from it." The it presumably is some high station in paradise, in heaven. "It is not for you to act arrogantly in it. Get out, you are one of the lowly." And then something remarkable happens. The devil turns to God and says, "Give me respite until the day they, that is humans, are resurrected." And God says, "Okay, you got it." God says, "You are one of those given respite." And the devil then says, "Well, now that I've got my respite, I'm going to let you know what I'll do. I'm going to cause trouble." He said, "Because you have lured me, I will waylay them," this is verse 16, "on your straight path. Then I will come at them from before them and from behind them and from their right and from their left, and you will not find most of them appreciative." God says, "Get out of it, despised and vanquished. Whoever among them follows you, I will fill up hell with you all." Any thoughts on this episode where it seems almost like God and the devil come to agreement that the devil will have a certain role to lead humans astray?
Right. Now, this is a very interesting story, and I think it alludes to the complexity of the figure of Satan in early Jewish and Christian thought. And here we need to just back up a step and realize that within the Bible itself, Satan isn't this figure that we know him, say, from Milton's Paradise Lost. The term Satan, Satan in Hebrew, is someone who we might better translate an accuser, a prosecuting attorney, we might want to say, in the heavenly law court. And so his function was really quite neutral. He was to bring up, legal cases against, human moral agents that then God, in his wisdom, would adjudicate. His purpose wasn't simply to be the font of all evil. Though once we move into the post-biblical period, that becomes the dominant way in which Satan is viewed. But here in this story, we see the continuation of the earlier figure of Satan, of someone who is testing human virtue, who God, in his greater providential arrangement, allows to continue to have habitation on earth in order to discern whether human beings really are good for the sake of the good, or if their goodness proceeds from some other, dimension.
Right, right. Excellent. Well, I thought we'd continue and speak about maybe two more elements of this episode, which seem to involve almost a cosmological picture. We have sort of glimpses, I think, of a cosmology in the Quran. And maybe you could help us visualize that cosmology in greater detail or with greater clarity. When the devil comes down from this high station in heaven and into the garden, then we have the recounting of the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden. And after that sin, I sort of like to skip by that and get to the end of the story there. After that sin, God actually says to the three of them, and I'm quoting now from Quran, again, chapter 7 or Surah 7, verse 24, God seems to say to the devil and to Adam and Eve, the three of them, fall, some of you enemies to one another. On earth you will have residence and livelihood for a while. Which is an intriguing verse, because if they're going down to earth, where was the garden?
So that's a great question. And this is also something, obviously, that greatly interested early Jewish and Christian readers. And the notion that Eden was a heavenly realm and not a purely earthly one, probably, where does that come from? We could probably point to a number of different sources, but I'll just pick one. Right. At the end of the book of Genesis, there's a very peculiar verse in which God is said to clothe Adam and Eve with garments of skin, coat note or, as it's known in Hebrew. What are these? Actually, the history of Christian art is very interesting here, because typically when we see Adam and Eve evicted from the garden, for example, Michelangelo in the Sistine ceiling, they leave naked. Did Michelangelo not read the Bible? Doesn't he know that
Where's their clothing?
Where are the clothing? Where are these
It's there in the
skins?
text, yeah.
Right. Well, you will find some images of Adam and Eve clothed actually with animal skins, but normally they exit naked. So how does this come about? Well, we had a tradition of interpretation that understood this clause as not so much about animal skins that Adam and Eve were clothed with, but at this point in the story, God invests them with human skin. In other words, they move from a kind of angelic constitution to a more animal-like constitution. And the reason for that, at least it's explained among some of the church fathers, is this will allow them to survive once they're evicted from Eden and find their place on planet Earth with the rest of the animals. In other words, they're made to look, right, appear, and function like the rest of the animal kingdom. That's the mode of existence they're going to enjoy after their expulsion. But that means prior to their expulsion, they're not really on earth. So where are they? Well, they're in heaven. They are dressed, vested, if you were, like angels. And so as soon as we begin to understand the story that way, then of course when they're evicted, it's not an eviction from one locality to another on a horizontal axis, but rather they're there with the angels. And so they're booted out, we might want to say, from this heavenly realm and fall, literally, to earth, where they assume human flesh and live, among the animals as we do to this day.
And even though, the text of Genesis seems to suggest that the Garden of Eden is somewhere in Mesopotamia, because I think it refers to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as four of the rivers of paradise, or two of the four of the rivers of paradise. Is that right?
It does, but it also paradoxically has the river Gihon as well, which is a river that flows in the city of Jerusalem. So I think our author doesn't want to allow us to too neatly locate Eden on a map. I think what we have here with this river tradition is a tradition we do know from classical Mesopotamia, which is of this enormous cosmic mountain, as biblical scholars like to refer to it as, from which all the world's fresh waters flow. And because the world was thought to be divisible into four corners, we have that phrase frequently in Mesopotamian texts, there are often four rivers. But the idea is as much mythological as historical. In other words, it's not oriented so much to make us think about what spot on Earth will correlate to this particular spot, but to think of this cosmic mountain as the point of origin for all of the world's fresh waters from which humanity then derives its sustenance.
Right. Okay. Right. So ultimately we have Garden of Eden not anywhere in Iraq, but in heaven itself, on the top of this mountain.
Or we could say, within the framework of the biblical narrative itself, is that the biblical writer simply doesn't want us to be able to locate it here or there. Perhaps it's Jerusalem. There are elements in which there are parts of the Hebrew Bible that correlate Eden to Jerusalem. But, you know, as you mentioned, the Tigris and Euphrates correlate it to the east. So at least my sense is that the biblical text doesn't want to neatly solve that puzzle for us. It's a place that's not easily locatable in time and space. In fact, that's true of most of Genesis 1 to 11. The localities of where everything occurs, by and large, are not easily locatable on a map. I think the writer wants to tell us that these stories are taking place outside of ordinary space and time.
Right, great. So maybe just two more questions, and then we'll let you go. Thank you again for all of this. I was going to go back for just a moment to the episode of the unfolding of the scene in the garden in the Quran, where we have Adam and Eve's sin. And as we already mentioned, and as our students have noticed, no doubt, the other character in the garden is the devil. The devil himself is in the garden. Mm-hmm. Which may seem normal, particularly if you come from an Islamic or from a Christian background. You sort of have this idea that it was the devil who tempted Adam and Eve, after all, and caused all this trouble. But when we look at Genesis itself, there's no devil to be found. How does that happen? How do you see it that in Genesis there's no devil, there's only a serpent, but we end up with a Quran in which there's no serpent, but there is a devil?
Well, that's a great question. So we do have, you know, very early on the correlation of the snake with the devil. And we have all kinds of early Jewish and Christian interpretive traditions that try to relate the snake, why the snake and the devil. So that would be one issue. But if we were to look for a spot in the Bible for why, you know, Christian and Jewish readers could speak with some confidence about the devil actually being in Eden, we'd want to look at a very peculiar chapter in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, which describes a being like Adam abiding within the Garden of Eden. And this was understood very early on. We can find it in Origin, for example, as the story of Satan's glory prior to his fall. He was this angelic being residing within the domain of Eden. There's much more I could say about this topic, but perhaps that's sufficient for your question.
Right. Okay. Terrific. So just to conclude, I thought I'd ask maybe for your general reflections about what this says about the Quran and the Bible. When I say this, I mean, what are these particular observations that you've been making about the role of Adam and the devil in the Quran say more generally about the relationship between Quran and Bible? How should we conceive of the relationship between these two texts?
That's a really good question. And I think the Quran for me is a very interesting and important document for scholars, certainly of biblical religion, because it contains, as you've mentioned, so much biblical data. But what's interesting about the Quran, at least to me, is that the biblical data that we learn of in the Quran is never simply the Bible taken at its simple sense.
As the case of maybe the devil versus the serpent in the garden shows us, maybe.
Exactly. No, I think that, and that's what's so interesting about it, is the Quran gives us a window into how the Bible was viewed and understood by Jews and Christians in the 7th century. Because where do these stories come from? Now, of course, I'm not speaking as a religious Muslim, but as a scholar of early Judaism and Christianity. In my understanding, Muhammad learns of these stories from talking to Jews and Christians on the street that he met. And he heard these biblical stories, but what's interesting to me is that the stories he hears are always the Bible plus this interpretive framework that's grown up around the Bible. And that's something that moderns frequently don't appreciate, is that the Bible within classical Christianity or Judaism was never simply the bare text, but it was always the text plus this exposition. And the Quran is a great window into that. It's almost like, we have Muhammad with a microphone going around to local residents, Jewish and Christian residents of the Arabian Peninsula, asking them, what's in your book? And the Quran tells us what he heard. And what he heard are these stories that are always the Bible plus the interpretive framework. So it tells us, I think, something very important about the way the Bible looks to early Judaism and Christianity.
Right. So, in fact, we can see the Quran as a text not only interesting in and of itself, but maybe interesting as a reflection of how people are reading the Bible in this context, in the 7th century Middle East, maybe the Arabian Peninsula in particular.
Exactly. Exactly.
Great. Before we conclude, Professor Anderson, I thought we would just give an opportunity to our students for this course, perhaps to learn a bit about the course you yourself are offering on edX. I believe you're teaching a course on the Bible for edX. Would you like to add anything about that?
Yeah, the course is called Jesus in Scripture and Tradition. And the concern of the course is to explore the identity of Jesus with respect to both the Old and the New Testaments, as well as the way in which Jesus' identity then is subsequently shaped in the early history of the church.
Great. Sounds wonderful. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.